I thought the moment I placed my newborn daughter in my mother-in-law's arms would be the one where all tension between us disappeared. I pictured her face softening, her eyes filling with tears, and maybe even her saying something kind, like she could see her son's features in the baby. After months of swollen feet, sleepless nights, and the exhausting roller coaster of labor, I had clung to that one hopeful image. A new life tends to heal old wounds, right? That's what I kept telling myself. The day we brought our daughter home, our house smelled faintly of antiseptic mixed with baby powder, and I was still buzzing from adrenaline and exhaustion. My husband was excited too, even if he looked like he hadn't slept in a week. He kept hovering around me and the baby like he was trying to memorize every detail. For a moment, it almost felt perfect until his parents walked in. My father-in-law had tears in his eyes the second he saw his granddaughter. He bent down close, whispered how tiny she was, and thanked us for giving him such a blessing. The moment warmed me. I thought maybe, just maybe, his wife would share that same joy. But my mother-in-law stood, stiff at the doorway, arms crossed, eyes sharp as she scanned the baby wrapped snugly in her pink blanket. There was no trace of softness in her expression, just calculation, like she was already dissecting her features to find something wrong. I tried to ignore it. I asked if she wanted to hold her granddaughter. She didn't move. She tilted her head and said she didn't see much resemblance. Then she laughed lightly, like it was just a passing remark, but the kind that stung deep. I forced a smile and said that newborns change quickly, and she would probably start looking like her father soon. And that's when my mother-in-law said she'd pass on holding the baby for now because the child didn't exactly look like family. Her words punched me harder than any physical blow could. I froze, gripping the blanket tighter around my daughter. I glanced at my husband, expecting him to say something, anything to defend us. But he looked caught between embarrassment and silence, like he didn't know how to handle his mother's cruelty. I tried not to cry. I told myself it was just postpartum hormones making me overly sensitive. But as the day went on, she kept repeating subtle variations of the same thing. She said she didn't see her son in the baby's face. She wondered aloud if babies could take after random ancestors so strongly that they didn't look like either parent. She even joked that maybe the mailman's genes had snuck in somewhere. Each word dug a deeper hole in my chest. My father-in-law tried to diffuse the tension, cooing at the baby and saying she had her daddy's nose. But mother-in-law only scoffed and shook her head, insisting she didn't see it. By the time they left that evening, I was holding back tears so hard my face ached. That night, while rocking my daughter to sleep, I kept replaying her words in my head. She refused to hold her granddaughter because she didn't look like family. I wanted to scream. This was the woman who had preached endlessly about family unity, who had scolded me during my pregnancy for not involving her in enough doctor's appointments, who had said she wanted to be part of every milestone. Yet the moment the baby arrived, she reduced her to a stranger, an outsider, simply because she didn't fit whatever image she had imagined in her head. What hurt more was my husband's reaction, or lack of it. I told him later that night how cruel his mother had been. He said she didn't mean it like that she just had a blunt way of speaking and that I shouldn't take it so personally. That was the moment I realized she had gotten away with this kind of behavior her whole life because nobody ever called her out on it. The days that followed were supposed to be filled with joy. First baths, first family photos, endless cuddles, but mother-in-law's shadow loomed over everything. She refused to hold the baby at every visit, repeating that same excuse about the child not looking like family. She'd sit in the living room, purse her lips, and watch silently as I cradled my daughter, occasionally muttering that she couldn't connect with her yet. It was more than just cruel. It was dehumanizing. And then there was the way she looked at me. Every time our eyes met, there was this flicker of triumph in hers, like she had found the perfect weakness to exploit. I could almost hear the unspoken words in her gaze. That I had failed and that my child would never be accepted in her eyes, that she still had control over her son. I tried to focus on the small moments of happiness. My daughter's tiny hand curling around my finger, the way her little breath sounded when she slept on my chest, the softness of her hair against my cheek. I told myself that was what mattered, not the venom from someone who couldn't even bring herself to hold her own granddaughter. But it was impossible not to notice how my husband's demeanor shifted little by little. Every time his mother visited, he became quieter, distant, and defensive. He started asking strange questions like whether babies could really look completely different from both parents. He said his mother was just curious and not accusing, but I knew better. I could see the seed of doubt she had planted slowly sprouting inside him. It terrified me. Not because I doubted myself or my daughter, but because I knew how skilled his mother was at twisting narratives. She had the uncanny ability to plant poisonous thoughts and then step back, letting them bloom into full-blown paranoia without ever getting her hands dirty. Looking back now, that was the first red flag. That refusal to hold her granddaughter wasn't just a moment of cruelty. It was the start of something deliberate. She wanted to undermine me, to erode my husband's trust in me, and to make sure that no matter what, I would never feel secure in this family. At the time, I didn't know how far she was willing to go. I thought I was just dealing with a cold woman who couldn't get past her prejudices. I had no idea she was laying the groundwork to try to ruin my marriage entirely. But in that moment, sitting in the nursery with my baby asleep in my arms, I whispered to her that she was mine, she was loved, and no one, not even her grandmother, could take that away. I meant it as much for myself as I did for her. Update 1. From then on, it became a pattern. Every time she came over, she avoided holding my baby. She'd say things like she was tired, her hands hurt, or she didn't want to spread germs, but somehow she had no problem holding my brother-in-law's kids when they visited. I started to piece it together. Her avoidance wasn't about germs or tiredness. It was about her not accepting my child as part of her precious family. The words she had muttered, that my baby didn't look like family, echoed in my mind. It cut deep. But the thing that really stung was how she began whispering to my husband, subtle comments, quiet remarks that only he could hear. I didn't need to catch every word. I saw the effects. He'd return from a conversation with her, looking conflicted, sometimes cold, sometimes defensive. And then he'd start questioning things he'd never questioned before, like whether we rushed into marriage, whether I really loved him, whether the baby was planned, whether I had been too eager. I knew where those doubts came from. They weren't his, they were hers. At first, I tried to ignore it. I thought that if I just kept showing love, kept being patient, he'd see through it. But it only got worse. She escalated. She didn't stop at making him doubt me. She was sowing poison about our daughter too. She hinted at paternity in ways that were insidious and cruel, asking if he thought the baby had his eyes, if he thought her nose looked more like someone else's, if he ever wondered why she didn't resemble him. I found out when I overheard him one night. He thought I was asleep, but I wasn't. He stood by the crib, staring at our daughter with this conflicted look on his face, and whispered, almost like he was ashamed of the thought that he hoped she was his. My heart cracked in that moment. That wasn't his doubt. That was his mother's poison working its way into him. I confronted him the next morning. He tried to brush it off. He told me I was overthinking, that his mom just worried for him, and that she wanted the best for our marriage. I asked him outright if he thought I'd ever betray him, and he hesitated just a second too long before shaking his head. That hesitation gutted me. From that day, I stopped underestimating my mother-in-law. She wasn't just being difficult, she was actively trying to destroy my marriage. She thought she was doing an amazing job too, with that smug smile whenever my husband defended her or repeated something she'd said. She genuinely believed she was winning. What she didn't realize, however, was that the more she pulled at the threads, the more she was unraveling her own marriage. My father-in-law was always a quiet man, but not stupid. He saw what was happening. He saw how bitter she had become, how manipulative, how obsessed with controlling everything. He started spending less time at home, volunteering for extra shifts and spending nights in the garage just to avoid her constant complaining. When he was over at hours and he did speak, it was usually sharp, filled with irritation at her antics. I caught him once watching her while she badgered my husband about how I was changing him and how he wasn't the man she raised anymore. His face was a mixture of exhaustion and resignation. He didn't say anything then, but I could tell he was done. Done with her nonsense, done with the games. Meanwhile, I had to make a choice. I could either sit quietly and hope my husband saw through her manipulation, or I could fight back in my own way. I decided to fight back. Not with screaming or yelling, because that would only play into her hands. She wanted me to lose my temper so she could prove I was unstable or dramatic. Instead, I chose to remain calm, collected, and consistent. Every time she made a snide remark about my daughter, I would respond evenly, pointing out how healthy and happy she was. Every time she questioned my husband's choices, I'd step in. Every time she avoided holding my baby, I'd smile sweetly and thank her for keeping her germs away. My composure infuriated her, and I could tell it was driving a wedge between her and my father-in-law too, because while she thought she was winning by making my husband doubt me, she was also losing ground with the man who had put up with her for decades. He was beginning to see her not just as annoying, but as destructive. One evening when they were over at ours, I overheard their argument in the kitchen. My father-in-law's voice was low but firm, telling her that she needed to stop meddling in our marriage, that she had no right to make such cruel comments about our daughter. My mother-in-law's response was venomous, spitting out that she was just protecting her son and that she knew I wasn't good enough for him. It was the first crack in their marriage I had ever witnessed, and it wouldn't be the last. But at the time, I was still too focused on saving my own relationship to recognize what was really brewing between them. I poured my energy into proving to my husband day after day that I was here for him, that our daughter was his, that his mother's poison wasn't the truth. And slowly, painfully, I began to see the tide shifting. My husband wasn't completely free from her influence yet, but I could feel him start to question her instead of me. He began to notice the manipulation, the cruelty, the way she never offered love, only control. She thought she was tearing us apart, but in reality, she was setting herself up for the biggest downfall of her life. Because she hadn't realized yet that her own husband had reached his breaking point, and when he did, it would be brutal. I know that for a fact because I witnessed it. Update 2. My father-in-law had always been a quiet man, measured, reserved in every interaction. He rarely raised his voice, not even when people deserved it. He preferred just walking away when my mother-in-law stirred up her usual drama. But that night, after years of tolerating her bitterness, he finally snapped, and the room fell into stunned silence. We were at their house for dinner, same kind of gathering we'd been having every couple of weeks since my husband and I got married. Normally, I'd brace myself for the tension. My mother-in-law's passive-aggressive comments about my cooking, my parenting, my looks, even my career. But this time, it wasn't just little jabs. She went straight for the jugular, pointing out once again that my baby didn't look like her side of the family. She said it with that twisted smile as if she thought she was being clever, almost like she wanted everyone else at the table to nod along and back her up. My husband stiffened beside me, his jaw tightening, but he stayed quiet, something that had become an all too common pattern lately. And then she started in again, not content with one dig. She muttered that some things just didn't feel right and that maybe her son should think carefully about the kind of legacy he was building. The words had barely left her mouth when my father-in-law slammed his fork down so hard the plate rattled against the table. The sharp crack startled everyone, even the baby who whimpered in her high chair. His face was red, his voice rising with a force none of us had ever heard before. He told her to shut her mouth immediately. For a moment, it was like no one in the room could breathe. My husband and I just froze, eyes wide, while my mother-in-law blinked at him as though she couldn't process that he was speaking to her like that. He pushed his chair back and stood, his voice trembling, not from weakness, but from the sheer weight of the fury he'd been holding in for decades. He said he was sick to death of her constant cruelty, sick of watching her tear down everyone around her just to feel better about herself. He said that she had turned every family gathering into a battlefield, and he was ashamed of the way she treated not just me, but anyone she saw as a threat to her control. His voice cracked when he turned towards my husband. He said he'd watched his son grow up under her thumb, always trying to earn her approval, always bending to her moods. He said it broke him to see my husband, his own son, hesitate to defend his wife because he was too used to being manipulated into silence. My husband shifted uncomfortably, guilt flashing across his face, but my father-in-law didn't let him off the hook either. He told him straight out that it was time to grow a spine, to stop being the boy who was always desperate for his mother's love and finally step up as the man his wife and child needed. Then he turned back to her, his voice booming with finality. He said he was done pretending her behavior was tolerable, done making excuses, done standing by while she poisoned every relationship around her. He told her she had two choices. She could either start treating me and the baby with respect, or she could get used to living her old age alone because he wasn't going to let her destroy the family any longer. Her face went pale, then flushed an angry crimson. She sputtered, trying to laugh it off, saying he was overreacting, that she was only joking, that I was too sensitive. But he didn't budge. For once, the man who had always sat quietly in the background didn't let her words twist the situation. He cut her off every time she tried to make excuses, his voice unwavering. I sat there stunned, the baby now calm again in my arms, and I couldn't help but feel an odd mix of emotions. Relief that someone had finally stood up to her, gratitude that my father-in-law had my back, but also sadness that it had taken this long for the truth to come out. The silence that followed his outburst was heavy. My mother-in-law's lips pressed into a thin line, her eyes darting around the table as though looking for someone, anyone to defend her, but none of us did, not even my husband. For the first time since I'd met her, she had no audience, no one feeding into her games. She was just left with her own bitterness exposed for everyone to see. My father-in-law sat back down finally, his chest heaving, his hands still trembling with the release of everything he'd held in for so long. He looked at me then, and his eyes softened. He said he was sorry. Sorry that it had taken him this long to speak up. Sorry that he'd let things fester. Sorry that I'd had to endure so much while he stayed quiet. I swallowed hard, unsure of what to say. Part of me wanted to tell him it was okay, but it wasn't. It had never been okay. Still, I nodded, appreciating the sincerity in his voice. It was the first time I felt like I truly had an ally in this family. My mother-in-law, meanwhile, sat stiff and silent, her pride too wounded to lash out again. I could see the storm brewing in her eyes, but for once she had been put in her place. That night marked a shift for me. The power she held over every interaction cracked, maybe for good. And though I didn't know what the future would look like, one thing was certain. Her reign of unchecked cruelty had finally been challenged. And I had a feeling she wasn't going to like what came next. Update 3. The drive home after that dinner was suffocating. The silence in the car pressed down on me, thick and unbearable, and the hum of the tires against the road only made my thoughts louder. My husband kept his eyes fixed on the windshield, his knuckles white against the steering wheel, and for once I didn't feel like softening the edges of the night. I didn't feel like being the one to smooth things over, to pretend things weren't as bad as they were. By the time we pulled into our driveway, I couldn't hold it in anymore. I sat there in the passenger seat, staring at the dark outline of our house, and I finally said what had been clawing at me for months. I told him I wasn't even sure we should have gotten married. His head snapped towards me so fast I thought he'd hurt himself. His mouth opened, but I didn't let him speak. I needed to get this out before I swallowed it down again, before it got buried under another layer of his mother's poison and his silence. I told him that from the very beginning I had seen flashes of hesitation in him, the way he had dragged his feet when we first talked about moving in together, the way he asked me if we were rushing when I mentioned engagement, the way he had looked at me with panic instead of joy when I told him I was pregnant. I told him I remembered all of it, every flicker of doubt that crossed his face, and I had pushed it aside because I loved him and I wanted to believe we were in this together. But now, after all this time, I realized maybe I had been lying to myself. Maybe I had been the only one who truly wanted this. He muttered my name, his voice cracked, but I cut him off again. I told him I was tired of being the one who fought for us while he stayed quiet. I was tired of defending myself to his own mother when he wouldn't even defend me. I was tired of holding our family together while he let her pull at every loose thread. The words poured out of me faster than I could control them. I told him that every time he let his mother insult me, every time he stayed silent while she questioned our child's paternity, it wasn't just about her, it was about him. It was about the fact that he chose her comfort over mine, that he let me feel small and humiliated so he wouldn't have to deal with the discomfort of standing up to her. My voice shook, but I didn't stop. I told him I had carried the weight of his indecision long enough, that I had watched him hesitate at every milestone, marriage, parenthood, even just defending me in the simplest of moments, and I couldn't keep living like that. His hands gripped the steering wheel tighter, his breathing uneven. He tried to say he didn't mean it when he asked those questions about marriage or the baby, that he had just been nervous recently. But I shook my head. I told him those words had burned into me, that I could still hear them echoing in the back of my mind when things got hard. That when he asked me once if we'd made a mistake having a child, I had smiled and told him no. But inside, I had cracked open. I turned to face him then, tears streaking down my cheeks. I told him our daughter deserved parents who were certain about her, who loved her without hesitation, without question, without regret, and I wasn't sure he could give her that. He whispered that he did love her, that he loved me, but the words felt flimsy compared to the silence he had given me for years. I told him love wasn't enough, not when it came laced with doubt. Not when it came tangled with his mother's grip. My chest felt like it was splitting open as I said it, but I told him I was considering leaving, that maybe he and his mother could live together forever if that's what he really wanted. If cutting the umbilical cord was too much for him, I told him I wouldn't stop him, but I wouldn't stay chained to a marriage that felt like a constant battle for scraps of happiness either. His face crumpled then, and for the first time I saw fear in his eyes. Real fear. Not the anxious hesitation he always carried, but the look of a man who realized he might actually lose everything he had been taking for granted. I wiped my face with the back of my hand, exhausted, empty from spilling everything I had kept bottled up for years. My voice was quieter now, but steadier. I told him that I wasn't asking for perfection. I never had. I just needed to know he was in this with me. That he wasn't still standing in two worlds, half tethered to me and half shackled to his mother. That he wasn't still wondering if marrying me or having our daughter had been a mistake. I told him that if he couldn't give me that certainty, then I couldn't stay, because I refused to raise our child in a house where doubt hung in the air like smoke, where silence spoke louder than love. We sat there for what felt like hours, the engine ticking as it cooled, neither of us moving. He looked broken, his hands limp in his lap now, his lips parted like he wanted to speak but couldn't form the words. I finally unbuckled my seatbelt and stepped out of the car, lifting our daughter from her car seat. She stirred slightly against my shoulder but didn't wake. I kissed the top of her head, breathing in her warmth, and whispered to her that she was the only thing I was certain about in my entire life. I walked into the house without looking back at him, my heart heavy but clear. For the first time, I had said everything I had been holding back, every truth that had weighed on me, and I knew deep down that whatever happened next would depend on whether he finally chose us, or stayed tied to the woman who had been slowly destroying us all along. Update 4. It was 2 weeks after the chaos when I heard the pounding on my front door. The sound was sharp, impatient, almost desperate, and for a moment I thought it might be a neighbor complaining about the noise from my daughter crying. But when I peeked out of the small glass panel beside the door, I saw her, my mother-in-law, standing there like a storm, her face contorted into something between rage and devastation. She didn't even wait for me to speak. She started yelling, calling out my husband's name, demanding he come outside, screaming that she needed him now more than ever. Her voice cracked as though she'd been crying, but there was no sympathy left in me to even consider that possibility. I opened the door just enough to step forward, blocking her view inside. I told her calmly but firmly that her son wasn't home. Her eyes darted past me anyway, searching for him like a vulture scanning a field for prey. She tried to push forward, but I held my ground. And then I gave her the words that had been sitting in my chest, waiting for this moment. I told her to enjoy old age, being lonely, miserable, and sad. I told her she had worked hard to create this reality for herself. Now she had to live with it. My tone didn't waver. I made sure every syllable landed like a final nail in the coffin she had built for her own relationships. Her mouth dropped open, shock flickering in her eyes, but I didn't give her time to respond. I slammed the door shut right in her face. The echo of that slam reverberated through my chest like the closing of a chapter. For the first time in months, I actually felt the tiniest hint of relief. That night, my husband came home. His face was pale, drawn, and the weight of the last few weeks was etched into the lines of his expression. He sat on the couch trying to find the words, but I refused to make it easy for him. I kept my attention on folding my daughter's tiny clothes, each piece a reminder of who I truly had to fight for. Finally, he broke the silence. He said he had seen his father earlier and that things were bad. He said his father was going to divorce his mother. He asked if his mother had shown up at our door, and he wanted to know what had happened. I didn't sugarcoat it. I told him exactly what I said to her, word for word, and I didn't regret a single part of it. That's when I turned to him and laid into him, and I told him that I couldn't keep pretending this marriage was fine, that maybe we shouldn't have gotten married at all. Not if it meant tying myself to someone who could be so easily manipulated by his mother. I reminded him of every time he had questioned whether we were ready for a child after we had a child. Every time he had asked if our marriage was strong enough, and how those doubts weren't born from his own thoughts, but were whispers she had planted in his head. I told him that for months I felt like I was raising our daughter alone, fighting both his silence and his mother's venom. My voice cracked when I admitted that I had actually started to imagine a future without him in it. A future where I could raise my daughter in peace without having to prove her worth or mine to people who only saw us as inconveniences. I told him straight out that my decision to leave was getting stronger as each day passed, and it doesn't look like he wants to keep our daughter or our relationship. That if he wanted to stay attached to his mother so badly, he could go live with her and let her poison him for the rest of his life. No matter how many times I said it, it wasn't enough. I was so bitter, so restless, so sad. I wanted him to feel what I felt. The silence that followed was unbearable. His eyes glistened, and for a moment he didn't even seem to breathe. Then suddenly he dropped to his knees right there on the living room floor. His voice broke as he begged me not to leave, begged me to give him another chance, begged me to believe that he could put me and our daughter first. But by then, something inside me had already torn. I knelt down in front of him, close enough that he could see the tears in my own eyes. I told him that kneeling wasn't the point. What was the big deal about falling to your knees when even I could do it right now? It didn't fix anything. It didn't erase months of neglect, betrayal, and silence. I held his gaze for a moment longer and then stood back up, leaving him on the floor. His hands clutched at my knees, trembling, but I gently pushed them away. I told him I wanted full custody of our daughter, that there was no universe where I would allow his mother anywhere near her again. The weight of those words broke him. He collapsed further, his head bowed, his voice hoarse with sobs, as he kept repeating that he would change, that he would fight for us, that he couldn't imagine life without me. But I didn't move. I didn't comfort him. I looked down at him one last time, my chest tight but my voice steady. I told him that if he really wanted to fight for us, then he needed to prove it without expecting me to fix the mess he and his mother created. And then I walked away, leaving him crumpled on the living room floor, the sound of his cries following me down the hallway. I felt guilty, but I didn't feel cruel. I felt strong. For the first time in a long time, I knew exactly what my daughter and I deserved. Stay tuned for more stories from our girl relationships.